Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children. When we all come together, united, striving for this cause, then those who are killing America will see that they are up against the mightiest force for good that we know.
The war on drugs is one of the most enduring hallmarks of the Reagan administration. Reagan wasn't responding to any significant public concern surrounding drugs at the time, but rather public concern about race. The war on drugs employed rhetoric which capitalized upon the racial anxieties of white constituents while seeding systemic mass incarceration. The war on drugs, its founding components, and its institutional legacies continue to provide the structure of race relations in America today.
The end of Jim Crow marked the emergence of colorblindness in mainstream political discourse. Law and order rhetoric was first mobilized in response to the civil rights movement, drawing upon whites' racial fears of societal transformation while avoiding explicit mention of racial difference. Nixon was the first to call for a war on drugs, sowing the rhetorical seeds of mass incarceration as a new racial regime in the decline of Jim Crow.
Reagan's drug war was realized by a series of policies which embedded mass incarceration as an institution. The confiscation of assets encountered by police forces for their personal profit was legalized in 1978. In 1981, drug law enforcement began to be supplied with military equipment, and in 1986, ACT allocated a whopping $1.7 billion to the war on drugs. Police funding increased by 420% from the beginning of the war to 2006. These policies secured law enforcement's long-term commitment to the war on drugs, and the number of individuals entangled in the carceral state increased fourfold.
Today, half of all federal prisoners are doing time for drug offenses. As shown in this graph, in 1998, black men were incarcerated at 7 times the rate that white men were, although a larger percentage of white men were drug users. Law and order rhetoric has an obvious racial history, and Reagan's new policies created clear incentives for police forces to carry out his war. However, how is it even possible for the war on drugs to operate along such racial lines?
The other half of this story is the historic vulnerability of African American communities. As the U.S. shifted from an industrial to a service economy starting in the early 1970s, quality manufacturing jobs disappeared and were replaced by low-pay, low-benefit service jobs. As with other economic shifts, black workers were uniquely vulnerable and quickly lost both their jobs and economic value. By 1984, the black unemployment rate had exceeded 20%. The ghetto rapidly transformed into a surplus population, which could be freely targeted for exploitation. The legal discrimination against job applicants with criminal records only expanded the appeal of the drug trade, and increases in drug use have lined the pockets of police and politicians as much as they have drug dealers.
The same stigma which led to the creation and targeting of the ghetto persists today in political rhetoric used to mobilize white voters. Our case in point, this video from the campaign trail for presidential candidate Hillary Clinton represents the political clout of this enduring racial imagery.
I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on crack and sent them out onto the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. She didn't.
How is it that politicians can continue to prey upon these same racial anxieties even in such liberal, progressive spaces? And in an age of national mainstream dialogue which finally tackles issues such as police brutality and racial profiling, how has the war on drugs become so deeply embedded in the fabric of America that it remains just beyond the reach of public discourse?